On the morning of August 21st, 1974, a man named Curtis Hayward stood on the deck of the Hughes Glomar Explorer watching seawater churn against the hull as the ship held position over a point in the Pacific Ocean, 16,500 feet above what the Soviets would have called a grave and what the Central Intelligence Agency called an intelligence opportunity. Hayward was 41 years old, a technical analyst with the CIA's Office of Special Activities, and he had been part of Project Azorian since its inception in 1969, when the idea of recovering a sunken Soviet submarine from the ocean floor seemed like something out of science fiction rather than operational reality. He was standing there that morning because he had been assigned to document everything that came up from the seafloor, to photograph it, catalogue it, analyze it, and determine what intelligence value could be extracted from wreckage that had been submerged for more than 6 years. The mission had been in motion for weeks already, the Glomar Explorer having arrived at the recovery site on July 4th, Independence Day, a detail that someone at Langley had found either ironic or appropriate, depending on their sense of humor about covert operations. Hayward had watched the crew lower the capture vehicle, a massive mechanical claw called Clementine, through the moon pool in the center of the ship, feeding it down through the water column, one 60-foot section of pipe at a time, until it disappeared into darkness that no human eye could penetrate. The operation had been conducted under the cover story that the Glomar was a deep sea mining vessel searching for manganese nodules on the ocean floor. A lie elaborate enough that Global Marine had actually constructed a functioning mining operation as part of the deception, complete with technical specifications and feasibility studies that could withstand scrutiny from Soviet intelligence analysts who were almost certainly watching from ships positioned nearby. Hayward had been briefed on the target 6 months earlier in a secure conference room at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. The target was K-129, a Soviet Gulf II class submarine carrying 3 SS-N4 nuclear-armed ballistic missiles that had gone down on March 8, 1968, approximately 1,560 miles northwest of Hawaii. The submarine had been on routine patrol, part of the Soviet Pacific Fleet based at Petropavlovsk on the Kamchatka Peninsula, when something catastrophic had happened. The exact cause was unknown, still classified even within Soviet naval archives, but the result was unambiguous. The submarine had sunk with all 98 crew members aboard, disappearing from Soviet radar without warning or distress signal. The Soviets had launched an extensive search operation, deploying dozens of ships and aircraft across thousands of square miles of ocean, but after 2 months they had abandoned the effort. The ocean was too vast, the depths too extreme, the technology inadequate. But the United States had advantages the Soviets did not have. The Air Force Technical Applications Center had detected an acoustic event on March 8th, consistent with an underwater explosion, and the sound surveillance system array at Adak had recorded data that allowed American analysts to triangulate the location to within 5 nautical miles. In August of 1968, 5 months after the sinking, the submarine USS Halibut had been dispatched to investigate. Halibut was equipped with a towed camera system called FISH, a 12-foot collection of cameras, strobe lights, and sonar designed to withstand extreme depths. Over 3 weeks, Halibut had photographed the wreckage in detail, taking more than 20,000 high-resolution images that showed the submarine resting on the ocean floor, damaged but largely intact, with sections of the hull visible and the conning tower recognizable despite the impact. The photographs had been analyzed by specialists at the CIA and the Office of Naval Intelligence, and what they saw justified the most expensive and ambitious covert operation of the Cold War. The submarine contained nuclear warheads, cryptographic machines, code books, communications equipment, missile guidance systems, sonar technology, and structural design elements that would reveal Soviet manufacturing processes and engineering capabilities. The intelligence value was incalculable. understanding how Soviet submarines operated, how they masked their acoustic signatures, how their missiles were targeted, how their communications were encrypted. All of this could shift the strategic balance in a conflict where nuclear parity meant that even a small advantage could determine survival or annihilation. President Richard Nixon had authorized the recovery operation in 1969 after extensive deliberation among the National Security Council, the Department of Defense, and the intelligence community. The cost estimates had been staggering, eventually reaching $800 million, the equivalent of approximately $5 billion in present-day currency, but the potential intelligence gains had been deemed worth the expenditure. The CIA had been tasked with leading the operation because the Navy lacked the capability to conduct such a mission covertly, and secrecy was paramount. If the Soviets discovered what the United States was attempting, they would either interfere directly or reposition their submarine forces in ways that would negate whatever intelligence was recovered. Hayward had been selected for the mission because of his background in technical analysis and his experience with classified materials recovered from hostile environments. He had worked on operations in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War, analyzing wreckage from downed Soviet aircraft to determine technological advancements in radar and missile systems. He had spent 2 years in West Germany studying East German surveillance equipment captured by defectors. He understood that intelligence work was not glamorous or heroic, but methodical and precise, requiring patience and an ability to extract meaning from fragments. On the morning of August 21st, the ship had been positioned over the wreckage for 47 days, and the capture vehicle had been lowered to the seafloor 3 weeks earlier. The process of grappling the submarine and beginning the lift had been fraught with technical challenges. The claw had to close around the hull without crushing it, had to distribute weight evenly to prevent structural failure, had to maintain grip pressure while being raised through currents and temperature variations that could cause metal to contract or expand unpredictably. Hayward had watched the engineers monitor instruments that measured tension, angle, depth, velocity, all of it transmitted through cables and displayed on screens in the control room. The lift had proceeded slowly, the submarine rising at approximately 8 feet per hour, a pace that seemed glacial but was necessary to avoid catastrophic failure of the capture mechanism. Then, halfway through the lift at approximately 8,300 feet below the surface, something had gone wrong. Hayward had been in the control room when the alarm sounded, when the tension readings on several of the claw arms dropped suddenly, when the engineers began shouting into radios, and the project director ordered an immediate halt to the lift. The submarine had broken apart. 2/3 of the hull had separated from the claw and fallen back to the ocean floor, including the section containing the missile compartment, the conning tower, and most of the crew quarters. What remained in the claw was the forward section, approximately 38 feet of bow, including the torpedo room and a portion of the forward battery compartment. The loss had been devastating from an operational standpoint. The missile technology, the cryptographic machines, the codebooks, all of it was likely in the section that had fallen back into the abyss, but the remaining section still contained intelligence assets, and the decision had been made to continue the lift and recover what could be recovered. It took another 6 days to bring the remaining section to the surface and secure it within the moon pool. Hayward had been among the first to enter the enclosed space where the wreckage now rested, dripping seawater and smelling of brine and decay and something else, something metallic and chemical that he could not immediately identify. The forward section of K-129 was more intact than he had expected given the violence of the break. The outer hull had been breached in several places, exposing internal compartments to seawater, but the structure had held together enough that individual components were recognizable. He could see the forward torpedo tubes, still sealed, the compressed air tanks used for ballast control, the battery cells that had powered the submarine's electrical systems. The first task was to document everything before any physical examination began. Hayward spent 3 hours taking photographs from every angle using a Nikon F2 camera with high-speed film designed for low-light conditions. He photographed the hull, the torpedo tubes, the internal bulkheads, the equipment racks, the valve systems, every detail that might be relevant to analysts back at Langley. The crew had set up portable lighting inside the moon pool, massive halogen lamps that cast harsh shadows and made the metal surfaces glare in the photographs, but the illumination was necessary to capture the level of detail required for technical analysis. After the photographic documentation was complete, a team of specialists began the physical examination. They wore protective suits because of concerns about radioactive contamination from the nuclear torpedoes, and they worked slowly, carefully, cataloguing each item as it was removed from the wreckage. The first significant discovery was the torpedoes themselves. There were 2 nuclear-armed torpedoes in the forward torpedo room, each equipped with a 15-kiloton warhead, approximately the same yield as the bomb that had destroyed Hiroshima. The torpedoes were in surprisingly good condition considering they had been underwater for more than 6 years. The casings showed corrosion and marine growth, but the internal mechanisms appeared intact when specialists opened the access panels to examine the guidance systems and arming circuits. Hayward supervised the documentation of the torpedoes, noting the serial numbers, the manufacturing markings, the design features that differed from previously known Soviet models. One of the torpedoes had a guidance system that incorporated a new type of gyroscope, smaller and more precise than anything American intelligence had seen in Soviet weapons before. The other torpedo had propulsion modifications that suggested improvements in speed and range. Beyond the torpedoes, the forward section contained equipment that revealed details about Soviet submarine operations. There were sonar components, hydrophones designed to detect enemy vessels, signal processing equipment that filtered acoustic data to identify specific targets. Hayward examined a control panel that had been ripped from its mounting during the submarine's descent to the seafloor, and he found circuit boards with components that indicated advancements in miniaturization and signal amplification. There were manuals, waterlogged and barely legible, but containing technical diagrams and operational procedures that could be cross-referenced with intelligence from other sources. One manual described emergency protocols for nuclear weapon deployment, specifying conditions under which the captain could authorize the use of torpedoes without direct communication with fleet headquarters. Another manual outlined procedures for evading American anti-submarine warfare systems, listing frequencies and patterns that Soviet submarines were instructed to avoid. The intelligence value of these manuals was significant not because they revealed secret weapons or capabilities that would change the strategic balance, but because they provided insight into Soviet doctrine, into how the Soviet Navy thought about submarine warfare, what they feared, what they prioritized, how they trained their crews. In the forward battery compartment, specialists found personal effects belonging to the crew. There were photographs, letters, identification papers, items that humanized the men who had died when the submarine went down. Hayward catalogued these items with the same methodical precision he applied to technical equipment, photographing each one, noting names and ranks when they were visible, setting them aside for later examination. Among the personal effects was a notebook belonging to a junior officer named Pavel Zhirov, a lieutenant who had been 26 years old when the submarine sank. The notebook contained handwritten notes about navigation calculations, weather observations, routine details about life aboard the submarine. On one page, Zhirov had written a letter to his wife that he apparently never had the opportunity to send. The letter described the monotony of patrol duty, the cramped conditions aboard the submarine, his anticipation of returning home. Hayward read the letter through a plastic sleeve designed to protect it from further deterioration, and he felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel during operations, a recognition that the intelligence he was collecting had been purchased with human lives, that the men who had died aboard K-129 had been sailors doing their duty, Not abstractions or enemies, but individuals with families and hopes and fears. The most significant discovery came on the third day of examination when specialists managed to access a sealed compartment near the forward bulkhead that had remained watertight despite the submarine's descent and the violence of the break. Inside the compartment was a metal case approximately 18 inches by 12 inches, secured with a combination lock that had corroded but was still functional. The case had been designed to protect sensitive materials from water damage, and when specialists finally opened it, they found documents that appeared to be operational orders and communications protocols. The documents were written in Russian, printed on thin paper that had been treated with some kind of waterproofing agent. Hayward examined them carefully, photographing each page before allowing anyone to handle them. The first document was a set of patrol orders issued on February 20, 1968, 5 days before K-129 had left port. The orders specified the submarine's patrol area, the duration of the patrol, the communications schedule, and the conditions under which the captain was authorized to deviate from the assigned route. The second document was more significant. It was a communication protocol manual describing the encryption system used for radio transmissions between submarines and fleet headquarters. The manual included cipher tables, frequency assignments, authentication codes, and procedures for emergency communications when standard encryption might be compromised. American intelligence agencies had been trying to break Soviet submarine communication codes for years, and this manual provided information that could accelerate those efforts significantly. The third document was perhaps the most revealing in terms of understanding Soviet strategic thinking. It was an assessment of American anti-submarine warfare capabilities prepared by Soviet naval intelligence in late 1967. The assessment analyzed American detection systems, including the sound surveillance system arrays positioned throughout the Pacific and Atlantic, and it identified gaps and vulnerabilities that Soviet submarines were instructed to exploit. The document revealed that Soviet intelligence had a fairly accurate understanding of American capabilities, that they knew where the listening stations were located, what frequencies they monitored, how they processed acoustic data. But it also revealed areas where Soviet understanding was incomplete or incorrect, miscalculations about detection ranges, assumptions about American response times, assessments of weapon effectiveness that were based on outdated information. Hayward spent hours analyzing these documents, comparing them with intelligence that had been gathered from other sources, identifying patterns and discrepancies. What he found suggested that Soviet submarine operations were more sophisticated than American intelligence had estimated in some areas, but also more vulnerable than the Soviets themselves realized. The encryption protocols were strong but not unbreakable. The evasion tactics were effective against older detection systems, but would be less effective against newer technologies that were being developed. The strategic assumptions underlying Soviet patrol patterns were based on an understanding of American capabilities that was accurate in 1967 but was already becoming outdated by 1974. The most troubling revelation came from a notation in the patrol orders that referenced contingency plans for nuclear weapon deployment in the event of heightened alert status. The orders specified that if the submarine received a coded signal indicating that Soviet leadership had elevated the military to a state of combat readiness, the captain was authorized to move closer to American targets and prepare nuclear torpedoes for immediate launch. The authorization did not require confirmation or secondary authentication. It relied on a single coded transmission that could be sent from fleet headquarters using protocols that were outlined in the communication manual. Hayward understood the implications immediately. If there had been a miscommunication, a misunderstanding, a technical error in the transmission or reception of such a signal, a Soviet submarine captain could have believed he was authorized to launch nuclear weapons when no such authorization had actually been given. The potential for accidental nuclear war, for a catastrophic miscalculation based on faulty communications, was greater than anyone in American intelligence had previously understood. He wrote a detailed report that evening, sitting in his cabin aboard the Glomar Explorer with the door locked and the documents secured in a safe bolted to the floor. The report outlined what had been found, what it meant in terms of Soviet capabilities and intentions, and what it revealed about vulnerabilities in the command and control systems that governed nuclear weapon deployment. He recommended that the information be shared with the National Security Council and the Department of Defense, that protocols be developed to minimize the risk of accidental escalation, that communication channels be established to allow rapid verification in the event of ambiguous signals or uncertain situations. The report went through several layers of classification review before being distributed to senior policymakers, and by the time it reached decision-makers in the Ford administration, Project Azorian had already been exposed by media leaks. A break-in at the offices of Howard Hughes's Summa Corporation in June of 1974 had resulted in the theft of documents linking Hughes to the CIA and the Glomar Explorer, and by February of 1975, reporters were publishing stories about the submarine recovery operation. The CIA had tried to suppress the stories, appealing to editors and publishers on national security grounds, but once the Los Angeles Times published its account, other media outlets followed, and the operation became public knowledge. The exposure ended any possibility of a second recovery mission to retrieve the remaining sections of K-129. Soviet ships were dispatched to guard the site, and the White House cancelled further operations. The Glomar Explorer was mothballed after experimental ocean mining voyages failed to generate commercial interest, and eventually the ship was converted for use in deep-sea oil drilling. Curtis Hayward returned to Langley in September of 1974 and resumed his work as a technical analyst in the Office of Special Activities. He was debriefed extensively about the recovery operation, about what had been found, about the intelligence value of the materials that had been brought to the surface. He testified before closed sessions of congressional oversight committees, explaining the significance of the documents recovered from K-129, defending the cost and secrecy of the operation against critics who argued that $800 million could have been better spent on other intelligence priorities. In the years following Project Azorian, some of the intelligence derived from the submarine wreckage was used to improve American anti-submarine warfare systems and to refine assessments of Soviet naval capabilities. The encryption protocols were analyzed by cryptographers at the National Security Agency, leading to advancements in code-breaking techniques that were applied to other Soviet communication systems. The information about Soviet strategic assumptions was incorporated into wargaming scenarios and contingency planning exercises designed to anticipate Soviet responses to various crisis situations. But the most significant impact of the intelligence recovered from K-129 was something that never appeared in classified reports or policy documents, something that existed only in the minds of the analysts and decision-makers who understood what the documents revealed. The realization that Soviet command and control systems were vulnerable to miscommunication, that a nuclear submarine captain could be authorized to launch weapons based on a single coded transmission, changed how American strategists thought about crisis management and escalation control. It reinforced the importance of maintaining communication channels with Soviet leadership even during periods of tension, of having mechanisms in place to verify intentions and prevent misunderstandings from spiraling into conflict. It contributed to efforts in the 1970s and 1980s to establish hotlines and confidence-building measures that reduced the risk of accidental nuclear war. Hayward never spoke publicly about Project Azorian. The operation remained classified for decades, and even after parts of the story were declassified in the 1990s and 2000s, many details about what had been recovered and what intelligence had been derived from the wreckage remained secret. He retired from the CIA in 1991, the same year the Soviet Union collapsed, and he moved to a small house in rural Virginia where he lived quietly, avoiding interviews and declining requests to comment on his career. He died in 2008 at the age of 75, and his obituary in the Washington Post made no mention of his work on Project Azorian or any of the other operations he had been involved in during his 26 years with the agency. The only public acknowledgement of the operation came in 1992 when CIA Director Robert Gates traveled to Moscow to meet with Russian President Boris Yeltsin. Gates brought with him the Soviet naval flag that had been used to shroud the coffins of 6 Soviet sailors whose remains had been recovered from the forward section of K-129. He also brought a videotape of the burial ceremony that had been conducted aboard the Glomar Explorer in September of 1974. The sailors had been given full military honors, their bodies placed in a steel chamber because of radioactive contamination, and buried at sea approximately 90 nautical miles southwest of Hawaii. The ceremony had been conducted in Russian, with prayers for the dead, and the Soviet national anthem played as the chamber was lowered into the ocean. Gates presented the flag and the videotape to Yeltsin as a gesture of respect and a symbol of the end of the Cold War. The presentation was private, conducted in a secure room without media presence, and no official record was made of what was discussed. But people who were present later described the moment as emotional, a recognition that the men who had died aboard K-129 had been sailors doing their duty, that their deaths deserved to be honored regardless of the political and ideological divisions that had defined the era in which they lived. The wreckage of K-129 remains on the ocean floor 16,500 feet below the surface of the Pacific Ocean. The location is still classified, known only to a small number of people within the American and Russian intelligence services. No further attempts have been made to recover the remaining sections of the submarine, and it is unlikely that any will be made. The technology exists now to perform such a recovery, but the political will and the intelligence justification no longer exist. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union no longer exists. The strategic importance of understanding Soviet submarine technology and operational doctrine has diminished as Russia has become a different kind of adversary, focused more on cyber warfare and hybrid operations than on nuclear submarine patrols. But the intelligence recovered from K-129 continues to influence how analysts and policymakers think about nuclear command and control, about the risks of miscommunication in crisis situations, about the importance of maintaining channels for verification and de-escalation. The documents that Curtis Hayward examined aboard the Glomar Explorer in August of 1974 revealed something that changed how the United States approached strategic stability, something that may have prevented miscalculations that could have led to nuclear war. Whether the $800 million spent on Project Azorian was worth, it remains a subject of debate among historians and intelligence professionals. The operation recovered only a portion of the submarine, missing the section that contained the most valuable intelligence targets. The exposure of the operation damaged CIA credibility and led to increased congressional oversight of covert activities. The long-term intelligence gains were significant but difficult to quantify in terms that would satisfy cost-benefit analysis. But Curtis Hayward, in the years before his death, told colleagues that he believed the operation had been justified not because of what had been recovered, but because of what had been learned. The intelligence from K-129 had revealed vulnerabilities in systems that both superpowers relied on to prevent nuclear war, and that knowledge had contributed to efforts to make those systems more robust, more resistant to error, less likely to turn a misunderstanding into a catastrophe. He believed that Project Azorian had succeeded not because it stole Soviet secrets, but because it provided insight into how close the world had come to destruction through accident rather than intention, through miscommunication rather than malice. And in that sense, the $800 million and the 6 years of planning and the thousands of hours of labor by engineers and sailors and intelligence analysts had been an investment not just in American security, but in the survival of civilization itself. The submarine that Curtis Hayward examined in August of 1974 had carried weapons capable of destroying cities, of killing millions, of triggering a nuclear exchange that would have ended modern society. But it had also carried documents that revealed how fragile the systems were that prevented such weapons from being used, how vulnerable the world was to mistakes and misunderstandings, how important it was to maintain communication and verification even between adversaries. That knowledge, extracted from wreckage at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, may have been the most valuable intelligence recovered during the entire Cold War, not because it gave the United States an advantage over the Soviet Union, but because it helped both sides understand the risks they were taking, the dangers they were courting, the necessity of finding ways to prevent accidents from becoming apocalypses. Curtis Hayward spent 3 weeks aboard the Hughes Glomar Explorer in the summer of 1974, documenting what came up from the ocean floor, analyzing what it meant, writing reports that would be read by presidents and generals and intelligence directors. And then he went back to Langley and continued his work, analyzing other intelligence from other sources, contributing to other operations, living the anonymous life of a career intelligence officer who understood that his work would never be publicly acknowledged, that his contributions would never be celebrated, that the world would never know what he had done or why it mattered. But he knew. He knew what he had found inside that Soviet submarine, what it had revealed about the systems that governed nuclear weapons, what it had contributed to preventing the war that everyone feared and no one could survive. And for Curtis Hayward, that knowledge was enough.